Ciders are often associated with fall, whether it's the crisp air, the leaves falling, or most likely because apples are actually in season in the fall. But that doesn't mean we can't enjoy a bright, bubbly, hard apple juice while the weather warms up.
Today, I put together a super simple spring-inspired cider that anyone can make and enjoy.
If you've never made a cider, I'm here to say that you absolutely should. It's without a doubt the easiest home fermentation project. At its core, it's just apple juice and yeast. So if you grocery shop, you can make hard cider. And at this point, I've shown 12 variations of cider recipes on this channel. So there's plenty of options for you to choose from. But really, I've never made one for spring. And that is about to change. There's a bunch of ways you could go about making a spring-inspired cider. Herbs and flowers immediately come to mind. Things like lavender, mint, even dandelions are great options. But more recently, I've seen a trend of rosé ciders that are a beautiful pink color and have bright flavors thanks to botanicals, teas, and even fruits. So that's my goal with this one. Let's get everything together and I'll talk more about what I use to make my rosé cider. Like every other recipe I make, it all starts with store-bought apple juice. Of course, you can get fancy with your choice, or even find apples and press them yourself. And maybe you'll be able to taste the difference. But I tend to find that the cheaper the juice, the better the product. The big thing you just need to avoid are preservatives that will inhibit yeast growth. Speaking of yeast, you can go many ways with this, and every yeast will contribute different flavors to the final product. I like to either use a beer yeast or a wine yeast, like this one. You can find these at homebrew stores or online, and I've got links in the description to anything I'm using. But worst case, you can always try to use bread yeast at the grocery store, although I don't recommend it. If you want the best possible final product, try to get some proper brewing yeast. The thing I like about this specific wine yeast is that it can be fermented anywhere between 64 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit, about 17 to 30 degrees Celsius, which is a nice range for most homes. Other yeasts can tend to freak out a bit if you ferment them outside of their preferred zones. Also, I just like how this yeast tastes in the final cider. Dry, but not sickly sour. An optional ingredient is yeast nutrient. You can think of it like vitamins for yeast. The yeast can do the job without them, but it will improve their ability to perform and can lead to a cleaner tasting final product. This one is Fermento, an organic yeast nutrient. But again, don't stress if you can't find this. Now let's talk flavor. Off the bat, our rosé cider needs to be, well, rose color, which is like a slight pink.
No shit, Sherlock.
Several foods can achieve this, but I thought raspberry would be a nice addition. It'll give us a reddish color, but also add a bit of a fruity, floral flavor. When it comes to fruit, I love using frozen fruit. Freezing the fruit breaks down the cell walls so they can more easily give up their flavor and color. And usually I go about 1 pound per gallon of juice, or roughly 500 grams for every 4 liters. Just dethaw the bag an hour or so before making the recipe. Next, I want a floral touch, and additionally I thought about using some actual rose petals, or even rose extract. But that made me a bit nervous about making a perfume cider. So I opted for rose hips. Rose hips are basically the fruit of roses, which I had no idea that they made. They form after the flower has been pollinated and drops its petals. And they kind of look like little craisins or dried cranberries, honestly. They're said to have a citrus flavor with slight floral undertones. I've never used them before, but I figured this would be a great addition to our rosé cider. Other good options could have been strawberries, hibiscus flowers, cherry blossoms, or even just using red apple skins to help give a slight redness. I decided to make a tea with the rose hips to help extract their flavor and control how much impact they have. You could just add them right into the fermenter, but having never used them, I didn't know what it would taste like. I infused 6 tablespoons of rose hips in water for 15 minutes, and it made a wonderfully zippy tea. It honestly reminded me a lot of hibiscus tea. Alright, now let's put it all together. I like to start with the fruit, followed by the juice. And then the nutrients, followed by the rosehip tea. The colder frozen fruit and warm tea kind of counteract each other in terms of temperature. But once I was in the acceptable temp range for the yeast, I added the yeast in. Gave it a good shake to mix it all up, and added an airlock to let the CO2 made during fermentation escape. I let this ferment at room temp for about a week. Taking a gravity reading helps us see how much sugars were fermented out, giving us an idea of alcohol content. This cider started at 1.050 and ended at 1.0, meaning this cider is about 6.5%. You can always add more sugar or even apple juice concentrate to increase the alcohol content, but this was fine for me. Once I knew it was completely done fermenting by checking the gravity several days in a row and not seeing any change, I threw the fermenter in the fridge to cold crash. This makes all the fruit and any yeast sediment drop to the bottom so we can get the clearest cider possible. It did get quite hazy during fermentation, so this can be quite helpful. Then I kegged it up. If you don't have a keg, you can do bottle conditioning by adding sugars into the bottle and then sealing them for a few weeks to build pressure. If you want to know more about that, I'll include a link to a video where I show all the steps. Or you can always just serve it still. I like kegging because I can really push the pressure up to about 30 psi to give me a nice sparkling finish, which will really go great with this rosé style cider. All that's left to do is give it a taste.
Here it is, and here we are. I decided since it's a nice spring day, might as well come out to the garden and enjoy this cider. And this turned out really good. For something that I've never made before, I'm super happy with how this came out. The color is a beautiful pinkish red, definitely more on the red orange side of things, but when the light hits it just right, it has that quintessential rosé color. The aroma, I'm getting apple and citrus. Those are the two flavors, and I think that the rose hips are really doing a lot of work here to kind of boost up that citrus flavor. There's also a bit of a floral thing coming through, but let's give it a taste and see. Oh man, that is really good. The Cote Blanc yeast is perfect for ciders, and it's my favorite yeast for ciders because it dries out the cider just enough. Despite it fermenting all the way down to 1.0, it does not taste like it at all. I love that that yeast kind of leaves some residual sweetness, which means I don't need to back sweeten and I can still enjoy this, but it's not too sweet that it becomes cloying or not as thirst quenching. This is the perfect level of sweetness that I enjoy for my ciders. On the flavor, I'm definitely getting apple, and that's to be expected, but there is a secondary flavor. That citrus rosehip flavor does come through pretty well, and I think doing it as a tea was a nice way to do it because I was able to dose it just how I like it. And yeah, it has this like bright citrus, and then also there is a raspberry thing. When I first tasted it, raspberry was the dominant flavor, kind of overpowered the apple, but as it's kind of aged and smoothed out, that has kind of gone away. It's still there in the back end, but the citrus apple flavor is the flavor that I'm tasting now. And since we're out in the garden, I brought it in a bottle like this, so it did lose some of its carbonation. You can probably see that in the footage, but I'll try and cut in some footage here from home where I got it straight off the keg. And it is super spritzy. That 30 psi is perfect. It's kind of giving me rosé champagne vibes, which is awesome. But I am super happy with how this turned out. I think it is the perfect thing for warm weather. Ciders, they just don't get the love and respect that they need for non-fall times. This right here is a prime example of why I love to make cider and why I recommend more people make cider, because it is just so easy to make and you can experiment with it thousands of ways. So I encourage you to go out and try making your own cider. As I mentioned, I got a bunch of other recipes. In fact, here's a playlist for more ideas, and let me know what you want to see next. I definitely have some plans for some fall ciders, maybe some naturally fermented ciders. So if you got any other ideas, let me know. But until then, cheers and happy brewing.